Welcome to Valid History. Here, old photos tell real stories from the past. Please subscribe, like, and share to help keep history alive.
On April 16, 1947, Rudolf Höss, the longest-serving commandant of Auschwitz, was executed by hanging on the very grounds where he had overseen the systematic murder of over 1 million people. 11 construction workers eat lunch on a steel beam 840 feet above Manhattan in 1932, their casual ease a testament to the everyday courage of the men who built Rockefeller Center. Private John G. Winbury holds his 2-year-old son Robert in a last embrace in October 1940, days before sailing to Hawaii with the California National Guard, a moment of tenderness poised on the edge of war. In 1971, a quiet, unremarkable 13-year-old named Osama bin Laden visited Falun, Sweden, remembered by those who met him only as a reserve boy who did not stand out from the crowd. On November 25, 1963, 3-year-old John F. Kennedy Jr. saluted his father's flag-draped casket in Washington, a gesture that would become one of the most enduring images of grief in American history. During the London Blitz of 1940, British civilians sheltered from German bombs in the tiled corridors of Aldwych Underground Station, the city's own infrastructure repurposed as refuge against nightly destruction from the skies. By 1923, Vladimir Lenin, paralyzed, mute, and diminished by 3 strokes, sat flanked by his sister and a physician, the man who had reshaped a nation now entirely at the mercy of those around him. Adolf Hitler, shown here with 12-year-old Helga Goebbels in 1935, was reportedly fond of the propaganda minister's children. A decade later, bruises found on Helga's body suggested she had resisted the cyanide administered to her at the war's end. Felled in 1891 after standing for 13 centuries, this ancient tree served as a living witness to eras of human history stretching back to the early medieval world, its end marking an irreversible loss. In 1948 Chicago, a handwritten sign reading "For Children for Sale" hung outside the Chalafou home, where Ray and Lucille, unemployed and facing eviction, had reached a desperation that no photograph alone can fully measure. Built in Portland, Oregon in 1905 and celebrated as the world's largest log cabin, this remarkable structure stood for nearly 6 decades before fire consumed it entirely in 1964. 11-year-old Otha Porter Martin stands at the Turkey Knob Mine in West Virginia in 1908, one of countless child laborers whose working lives began before adolescence. He survived to see the age of 77. On January 29, 1979, 16-year-old Brenda Spencer opened fire on a San Diego elementary school from her home across the street, killing 2 and wounding 9, later offering only that she did not like Mondays. A United States Marine's helmet, photographed on Okinawa in 1945, bears the unmistakable dent of a Japanese bullet stopped cold by a horseshoe the soldier had carried as a charm, proof, on one occasion, that luck holds. Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin, photographed together at Levadia Palace in February 1945, represented 2 of the 3 powers whose decisions at Yalta would determine the shape of the post-war world for generations. Princeton freshmen and sophomores, mud-streaked and triumphant after a mass snowball fight in 1893, captured in a photograph that reveals the informal rituals binding generations of students to the same enduring institution. Anne Frank, whose diary written in hiding between 1942 and 1944 during the German occupation of the Netherlands, became one of the most widely read personal testimonies of the Holocaust and of the Second World War. Mary Ann Bevan, an English nurse turned sideshow performer billed as the world's ugliest woman, had her appearance transformed by acromegaly, a condition causing excess growth hormone that enlarged the jaw, forehead, and nose throughout her life. Photographed in the 1840s, this woman, born in the 18th century and most likely alive during the American Revolution, stands among the oldest human beings ever to have sat before a camera and been preserved by light. Charlie Chaplin, still dressed as his beloved character the Tramp, and actress Paulette Goddard rest together on the set of Modern Times in 1936, a quiet pause caught between takes of one of cinema's last great silent films. On a General Motors assembly line in 1969, the mechanized precision of American industrial production stretched across the factory floor, defining an era when Detroit's output shaped the economic identity of a nation. A young couple passes balanced rock at Colorado's Garden of the Gods in the 1920s, their automobile placing them at the intersection of a new motoring culture and one of America's most ancient natural landmarks. In Philadelphia in 1922, a single civil servant stood at a busy intersection operating a manually controlled traffic signal, his presence the only thing standing between order and the chaos of the modern city. During the First World War, a dedicated Pigeon bus served as a mobile collection point for messenger pigeons retrieved from the front lines, turning a centuries-old method of communication into an instrument of industrialized warfare. A Royal Navy diver demonstrates the extraordinary method he used to photograph the wreck of the submarine HMS Thetis, a Leica camera strapped inside his diving helmet, the shutter trigger held between his teeth. Two players lean over a Magnavox Odyssey in 1972, engaging with what was then the world's first commercially available home video game console, unaware they were participating in the birth of a global industry. In 1986, Cleveland released 1.5 million balloons into the sky in a single event, a spectacle that ended in tragedy when two men lost their lives in the chaos that followed. In 1953, the orange groves that had long defined the landscape of Anaheim, California, were cleared and flattened to make way for Walt Disney's vision of an entirely new kind of American entertainment destination. A sign photographed in Greenville, Texas, in the 1950s stands as an unambiguous document of institutionalized racial segregation, its public display a reminder of the legal and social structures that defined life in the American South. Workers carved through the landscape of Panama in 1913, their labor part of one of the most complex and costly engineering projects in human history, the excavation of a canal connecting two oceans. 62,500 punched cards stacked together in 1955 to store just 4.5 megabytes of data, a physical monument to how recently the storage of information demanded enormous space and labor. Gasoline sold for 2 cents per gallon in the 1920s, a price point that reflected both the early abundance of American oil production and the infancy of a car culture that would reshape the entire nation. Danish Arctic explorer Peter Freuchen and his wife Dagmar were photographed together in 1947 by Irving Penn, producing an image whose raw physical presence made it one of the most unforgettable portraits of the post-war era. Automobiles lined the rim at the Grand Canyon in 1914, just years after the site became a national monument, marking the earliest collision between America's emerging car culture and its most dramatic natural landscape. President George W. Bush sits in a Florida classroom on September 11, 2001, the moment an aide whispered news of the terrorist attacks into his ear, captured in a photograph now inseparable from the history of that day. Ironworkers pose for a photograph atop the completed North Tower of the World Trade Center in 1973, their casual confidence against the New York skyline carrying a weight that only the events of September 11, 2001 would give it. An Apsarok man on horseback was photographed in 1908, image capturing a moment in the long and ongoing history of a people whose way of life had been systematically threatened by decades of American expansion. In 1968, Paul Allen, aged 15, and Bill Gates, aged 13, connected to a PDP-10 computer at the University of Washington through a teletype terminal at their Seattle school, an early encounter that pointed toward the future they would build. A portrait of the Twin Towers assembled from the photographs of all 2,977 people killed in the September 11 attacks transforms the buildings themselves into a memorial made entirely from the faces of those lost inside them. Telephone line repairmen are photographed at work on August 15, 1929, their precarious labor maintaining the communication networks that modern industrial society had come to depend on entirely in the decades since the telephone's invention. The surviving first-class dinner menu from the RMS Titanic, now held at the Titanic Museum in Belfast, Northern Ireland, lists the final meal served aboard the ship on the night it struck an iceberg and sank. Children fish for dropped coins through street grates in New York City in the 1930s, the image compressing the economic desperation of the Great Depression into a single gesture at the edge of the pavement. In 1965, Beatlemania swept through England with a force that transformed 4 musicians from Liverpool into a cultural phenomenon whose reach extended far beyond anything the music industry had previously witnessed or prepared for. In Washington, D.C. in 1936, 1,300 candidates sat for a typist examination, the sheer scale of applicants reflecting both the severity of Depression-era unemployment and the competitive demand for skilled administrative workers. Key-Doozle opened in 1949 as America's first fully automated retail store, its mechanical ordering system anticipating by decades the frictionless self-service commercial environments that would eventually become standard across the developed world. Walt Disney is photographed in France around 1919 in his Red Cross ambulance driver's uniform, his presence in post-war Europe coming just years before he would return to America and begin building an entertainment empire. Elvis Presley rides his 1971 Harley-Davidson FLH Electroglide motorcycle through Memphis on June 30, 1972, with Mary Self at the corner of South Parkway East and Elvis Presley Boulevard, a street already named in his honor. Photographs taken in Constantinople in 1890 survive in rare color, their preservation offering an unusually vivid record of the Ottoman city's architecture, streets, and daily life during the final decades before the empire's collapse. Before mechanical refrigeration became widely available, workers sawed ice from frozen lakes in the early 1900s to supply homes with the blocks needed for cellars and iceboxes, performing dangerous labor in extreme cold to meet everyday demand. A Tokyo subway employee physically pushes commuters into an already packed train car in 1975, the image documenting the extreme density of urban transit in a city whose post-war growth had far outpaced its infrastructure. Los Angeles police officers disguised themselves as women in the 1960s to apprehend a purse snatcher, a plainclothes operation whose photographic record sits somewhere between law enforcement history and the era's unexamined assumptions about gender and crime. In 1609, Galileo Galilei made the first systematic drawings of the moon's surface after observing it through his telescope, producing images that challenged centuries of assumption by revealing a landscape marked by craters, mountains, and shadow. A centrifugal force carousel of the 1950s spun riders against its walls as the floor dropped away beneath them, a machine whose mechanical extremity was eventually deemed too dangerous and was removed from public operation entirely. A photograph taken around 1905 shows Mount Rushmore before the carving began, its granite face an unmarked cliff in the Black Hills of South Dakota, decades away from the presidential monument that would be blasted into its surface. A construction photograph from 1935 captures the Golden Gate Bridge mid-assembly above San Francisco Bay, the emerging steel structure documenting the immense engineering effort required to span one of the world's most treacherous stretches of open water. A 1993 poster listing the full range of media and communication devices available at the time now stands as a document of how comprehensively a single smartphone would eventually absorb, replace, and consolidate every one of them. In 1969, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers temporarily diverted the flow of the American side of Niagara Falls, exposing the bare rock beneath and allowing engineers to assess the geological stability of the riverbed below. A New York City police officer halts Manhattan traffic in 1925 to allow a cat and her kitten to cross safely, the moment captured by photographer Harry Warnecke in an image whose quiet tenderness has outlasted its news value. Between 1870 and 1890, photographer George Kennan documented the faces and dress of people across the Russian Empire, producing a visual archive of remarkable ethnic and cultural diversity within a single imperial state. Photographs of everyday life in the 1970s capture a decade defined by particular textures, the colors, clothing, interiors, and technologies of an era that sits at the precise midpoint between the post-war world and the digital age. Freddie Mercury performs in Manchester in 1986, his command of the stage at what would prove to be one of his final major concert tours, capturing an artist at the peak of his power just years before his death. In 1925, Ivan Unger and Gladys Roy played tennis on a biplane flying at 3,000 feet, the stunt compressing the era's fascination with aviation spectacle into one of its most photographically striking and genuinely dangerous demonstrations. Workers fell a coastal redwood by hand using axes and two-man saws, a process that could take days on trees whose age measured in centuries, their labor a transaction between human ambition and the oldest living things on the continent. Scene 1, take 1 of a film widely regarded as among the greatest ever made, is captured in a clapperboard photograph, the unassuming record of a production's very first moment carrying the full weight of the masterpiece that followed. A 1955 photograph of the Las Vegas Strip shows a sparse desert road lined with only a handful of low-rise casinos and motels, an almost unrecognizable precursor to the illuminated mega-resort corridor that would rise in the decades ahead. A 1951 Chicago photograph documents a single cabinet combining a television set, a radio, and a cocktail bar, a piece of furniture that treated home entertainment and social drinking as naturally unified functions of post-war domestic life. A purpose-built animal ambulance operated in the 1940s to rescue and transport injured animals, its existence reflecting the presence of organized animal welfare institutions at a time when working horses and street animals still populated urban environments. At least 300 Roman gold coins dating to the late imperial era were discovered inside a soapstone jar in the basement of the Cressoni Theater in Como, northern Italy, one of the most significant Roman coin finds in recent memory. Seiko's 1982 TV watch embedded a working liquid crystal display into a wristwatch face, with the tuner housed in a separate external unit, offering its owners live broadcast television on their wrists more than 2 decades before the smartwatch existed. Photographers traveling the Swedish countryside between 1899 and 1945 documented Viking runestones still standing in fields and forests, ancient carved monuments that had remained in place for nearly 1,000 years by the time the cameras reached them. Physicist Louis Slotin is photographed with the Trinity Tests gadget bomb in 1945, a year before a slipped screwdriver during a criticality experiment exposed him to a lethal dose of radiation, killing him 9 days later. In 1887, workers laid the first foundations of the Eiffel Tower in Paris, beginning a construction project that would take 2 years and produce a structure its critics called an eyesore, and history would make one of the world's most recognized landmarks. Cars belonging to commuters who never returned sit abandoned in the Giants Stadium parking lot after September 11, 2001, their ordinary presence transformed into a record of the scale of individual lives interrupted and ended that morning. Charlie Chaplin is photographed without his tramp costume or makeup in 1920, his well-dressed and conventionally handsome appearance a reminder of the deliberate theatrical distance between the man and the iconic character that made him famous. 2 acrobats balance on the pinnacle of the Empire State Building in 1934. Their stunt performed at the summit of what was then the world's tallest structure, with the full drop of over 1,000 feet below them. Howard Hughes completed construction of the H-4 Hercules flying boat in 1947, the largest aircraft ever built to that point, which flew only once before being permanently grounded and entering history as the most ambitious aviation project never put into service. A mother holds her infant among a family of 9 living roadside near the Tennessee River on U.S. Route 70 in March 1936, the image joining the broader visual record of displacement and poverty that defined rural America during the Depression. Around 1867, a Native American man is photographed gazing over the newly completed Transcontinental Railroad in Nevada, his presence at the edge of the tracks framing the railway's completion as something witnessed from both sides of its consequence. The models who posed for Grant Wood's American Gothic stand before the completed painting in 1942. The gap between the famous image and the actual people behind it collapsed in a photograph that makes the painting's artifice visible. George Lucas is photographed on set in 1984, the image capturing the director at work in a pre-digital filmmaking environment that relied entirely on physical sets, practical effects, and photochemical processes rather than the computer-generated imagery that would later transform his industry. An 800-year-old drawing made by a 7-year-old boy named Onfim in medieval Novgorod, in what is now Russia, survives as one of the most vivid and human documents of childhood from the entire medieval period. Between 1945 and 1947, up to 70,000 British women left the United Kingdom aboard ships including HMS Victorious to reunite with American servicemen they had married during the war, one of the largest organized transatlantic migrations of the post-war era. Cyclists and support staff share cigarettes during the 1920 Tour de France, the image capturing an era in which tobacco was commonplace in elite athletic competition and no contradiction was perceived between professional endurance sport and smoking. Military records show that during the Second World War, jeeps were crated and shipped in a fully disassembled state, a logistics solution that allowed the compact utility vehicle to be packed efficiently into the cargo holds of transport ships. In 1948, George McLaurin became the first black student admitted to the University of Oklahoma but was compelled to sit segregated from his white classmates, a condition that persisted until a Supreme Court ruling 2 years later struck it down. Cow-shaped wooden shoes discovered in 1924 were used by Prohibition-era moonshiners to disguise their footprints in soft ground, a piece of material ingenuity designed to evade the law enforcement officers pursuing illegal distilling operations across rural America. In the 1890s, French artist Jean-Marc Coté produced a series of illustrated postcards imagining life in the year 2000, his predictions offering a window into how the 19th century's imagination projected technology into a distant and speculative future. Salvador Dali is photographed in 1954 using his own mustache as a painting implement, an act entirely consistent with the performative surrealism that defined not only his artistic output but his carefully constructed public persona. A manuscript page from Fyodor Dostoevsky's working draft of The Brothers Karamazov, completed in 1880, survives to show the novelist's handwriting, corrections, and compositional process behind one of the most studied works in world literature. On Thanksgiving Day, November 23, 1944, soldiers of the Army's 102nd Division eat a holiday dinner inside a shell-damaged house in Geilenkirchen, Germany. The improvised meal a small ritual of normalcy inside the ongoing destruction of the Western Front. The Eastern Airlines Reservation Center, photographed in Miami in 1970, shows rows of operators working at telephone consoles to manually process flight bookings, a labor-intensive system that the computerized reservation technology of the following decade would sweep away entirely. Photographs taken in 1898 document Bedouin nomads in a visual record that captures the material culture, dress, and landscapes of desert communities, whose way of life had remained largely unchanged for centuries before the modern era closed in around them. In 1982, artist Agnes Deans planted, cultivated, and harvested a 2-acre wheat field on a landfill site in Lower Manhattan, one of the most widely discussed works of land art produced in the United States in the 20th century. New York's tunnel police in the 1950s patrolled the city's vehicular tunnels, their beat one of the more unusual law enforcement assignments of the era, defined by noise, exhaust, and the constant flow of traffic beneath the city's rivers. A lamplighter is photographed lighting a gas street lamp in Glasgow in 1955, his work continuing a tradition that would officially end 16 years later when the city's last remaining gas lamp was ceremonially converted to electric light in 1971. A worker stands inside one of the Panama Canal's massive lock chambers in 1912, his scale against the concrete walls, communicating more directly than any statistic the extraordinary physical dimensions of the structure being built around him. The $5 banknote issued in 1899 featured the engraved portrait of running antelope, chief of the Hunkpapa Lakota Sioux, making it the first and only time a Native American figure served as the central image on any piece of United States paper currency. Neil Armstrong and David R. Scott are photographed waiting in their spacecraft on the ocean surface on March 17, 1966, following the successful completion of Gemini 8, the mission that performed the first docking of 2 spacecraft in orbit. Between 1901 and 1985, a succession of individuals went over Niagara Falls inside barrels, the first of them surviving the plunge and sparking a tradition of increasingly elaborate stunts that continued across 8 decades of American daredevil culture. Albert Einstein is photographed in his role as a professor in 1931, the image placing the theoretical physicist, already celebrated for his work on relativity, in the ordinary academic setting that formed the institutional context of his scientific career.